Hello, I'm Mary Phaeton. Welcome to Cover, where we meet West Australian authors and hear about their latest books. The show is presented by Writing WA, the peak body for writing and associated activities in Western Australia. My guest today is Paul Hardisty to discuss his book Reconciliation for the Dead. Welcome, Paul.
Nice to see you.
Now, this book is both a prequel and a sequel to two previous books where we meet the character of Claymore Straker. Tell us a little bit about him and about where we find him at the beginning of Reconciliation for the Dead.
It's 1980, apartheid era South Africa. He's a 20-year-old on the front lines in the South African army fighting what he's been told is the communist insurgency that we've all heard about. The first book is set 13 years later. So when we first meet him, he's a damaged, withdrawn character who's clearly been through some pretty bad times. And so the third book is really an attempt, many of my readers have asked me to do this, an attempt to explain why is he the way he is, why is he so affected, what were these terrible things that happened, and that's what the third book is really all about.
So was it your intent always to write the books in this order?
I think for a long time I thought that I should write this current book, Reconciliation for the Dead, first, to put them in chronological order. But in many ways, as I started to get to the point where I was ready to really sit down and write in earnest, I thought that I needed to go to Yemen in '94 during the Civil War and do something that was very personal for my first novel, to get off the mark, if you will, as a writer, to really gain credibility. Because that first book is very autobiographical in many senses. And the current book, Reconciliation for the Dead, is something that is less autobiographical, but more about exposing the nature of some terrible things that happened to the character and formed him.
Yeah. I mean, the book is a thriller, so we need to kind of avoid the spoilers, but I really want to talk about particularly the character of Claymore Straker and to understand more about him and who he is and I guess your relationship with him as well.
Yeah, I mean, Clay is, he's a very loyal person, and being 20 years old and being thrust into a very, very extreme situation, combat, fighting in Angola, and then slowly starting to come to realize that all the things that he's fighting for, all the things he's been told that he should believe in as he's been growing up in this apartheid system, are a lie. And the book really slowly peels away the layers of that lie. And of course, he then gets involved in some pretty terrible things, and it just completely changes him. It shatters him.
Well, I mean, in the extremity of the situations that he finds himself in, I think I forgot a lot of times how young he was. I had to keep reminding myself, you know, that this was a very young man in a very extreme situation.
Yeah, I mean, my two sons now are 22 and 19, so they're right in that age, and I look at them, still young and innocent, and to think of them being put in such an extreme position, and to witness the things that Clay witnesses, and then to have to make choices, to have to make life decisions based on what you've seen, with this moral dilemma literally tearing you apart, everything you've been taught to believe on one side, and what you know to be true on the other, and to be just on the other, and that shearing force inside him. Yeah, it's tough. And I look at my boys and I just think, wow, it's happened to a lot of people, but it comes out hopefully in Clay. It makes him who he is.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I guess the sequel part of Reconciliation for the Dead then is the fact that he's giving evidence at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established about '94 in South Africa after the abolishment of apartheid.
Yeah, '95.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in the acknowledgements of the book, you talk about how you came across this story as a context, which is way back when you were a teenager, when you first started to hear about this stuff. Give us a little bit of context around that.
So when I was when I was a young man, teenager, 16, 17, apartheid was in full swing, but starting to really crumble. The war was on. My dad's quite an internationalist. He's worked all over the world, and he had a lot of South African friends, and they used to come around, and they'd get drinking, and occasionally I'd be invited to sit in with them. And I heard some things then, as a very young man, that stayed with me. They were shocking. They were brutal. I couldn't believe them. I didn't believe them at the time. I thought, no, this, I'm innocent. They can't be true. But they sat in me for a long time. And then later on, I was working in the Ukraine, and I met two pretty gruff characters. One American who'd been in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, gunship pilot, and a South African who'd been fighting in Angola. And just sitting there with them, they were 10, 12, 15 years older than me, and listening to the stories unfold, I couldn't believe the shocking brutality. And again, I heard snippets of the same stories that I'd heard when I was young. And then later on, when I started to put this together and started to read the Truth and Reconciliation transcripts, which, by the way, if nobody's ever read them, they're an incredible, incredible read. Almost unbelievable that these things could and did happen. Lo and behold, I found the same stories. And right then I knew that I had to put them, I had to make them the centerpiece of the book.
You mentioned it all the way through the Operation Coast, which was a real thing. Yeah. Can you explain what was going on with Operation Coast?
Yeah, so during apartheid, the National Party government came to understand that apartheid was doomed. And they were doomed because of demographics. There were too many blacks and not enough whites. And so they started a secret chemical and biological weapons program, not only to fight their enemies on the ground militarily, but more importantly, to find ways of chemically and biologically killing or sterilizing the black population so that they wouldn't take over just by sheer weight of numbers. It's a shocking thing to say. Yeah. It's eugenics, I guess. It's terrible, but it's true. And I don't actually reveal that till the end of the book, but no, it's a real thing, and I'm shaking actually just thinking about it.
Yeah, it's an appalling concept to sit with, and I was curious actually to understand how, I guess, what you were trying to calibrate in terms of fictionalizing or not what actually happened there for the purpose of the book.
Yeah, the real danger there, as I'm sure you can appreciate, is that you trivialize it because you're writing ostensibly an entertainment. You want the books to be fun and exciting, and that people will read them for the twists and the turns and think, wow, that was great, I enjoyed that. To put such a terrible thing in a book like that is difficult. One of my colleagues at Arenda wrote a book just now called Block 46, and it's set in Buchenwald, one of the Nazi concentration camps. Again, you have to be very, very careful that you don't trivialize and make light of it. Hopefully, I don't. And the fact that the book is quite violent, I think, is partly because if it wasn't, then you would risk trivializing that terrible thing, Operation Coast.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and even in the first sort of 40, 50 pages, you are, as a reader, really exposed to some of the most confronting, horrible things. For me, some of the most horrible things I've ever read. And yet, as you say, you can't do justice to the story or to the gravity or enormity of what had gone on unless you do that. But what were you? I guess what were your considerations when you were creating these scenes of ghastly human behaviour?
Yeah, look, again, I'll come back to the first two books where throughout those two novels, as you start to know Clay a little bit better, there are flashbacks. So there are little chunks of information about his past, and you can tell this guy's been brutalized. Yeah. And so the first consideration is, well, what is that brutality? And look, let's face it, war is brutal, but civil war and race war are particularly brutal. And that's what that was. This wasn't a conventional war in the sense of two armies lining up and gallantry and all those kinds of perhaps old-fashioned concepts. Those civil war and race war are brutal, and they're no holds barred. And to be able to introduce a concept as heavy and as terrible as Operation Coast, you have to ease the. I know this sounds crazy, but you have to ease the reader into it.
Yeah.
And so even though it's very brutal, it's not as shocking as what comes later.
Yeah.
But hopefully, none of the violence is trivial and none of it's gratuitous, and it's part of the story. And to me, the important thing to do is to counterpoint it with light, with examples of humans rising above their worst selves and finding their best selves. And I think hopefully the book has many of those, of individuals in extreme situations finding their absolute best selves in the darkest times.
I read a review that called, because you're an engineer and a scientist, it said you were an unlikely bleeding heart. And I found that really interesting because I felt, had you seen that?
Yeah, I've seen
so
that.
how do you respond to that? Because I had the sense that your intent was to present the information without really making comment one way or the other, or to leave it to the reader to decide. So do you relate to the idea of being an unlikely bleeding heart at all?
I understand where that particular reviewer might have got that idea or chosen those, why he might have chosen those words. I don't think that that's how I write. Yes, the strong moral issues are at the core of what I write, and it's what gets me up in the morning and gets me in front of the computer writing. That's what drives me. But I don't preach. And even though, so in all that confronting violence and those situations that you read in those books, I don't pass judgment. The good guys, are they the good guys? Are the bad guys the bad guys? Well, often they're a little bit of both. In fact, invariably they're a little bit of both. And so I try not to pass judgment. I try to be quite clinical and to allow the reader to decide for themselves in the end what is the right thing. To me, that's really important. Put the reader there. Let the reader smell and see and feel what's going on so that they really feel like they're there, and then just ask them, what would you do?
Yeah, an invidious position is what Clay finds himself in often. I mean, it's interesting that you say that that's what motivates you to get in front of the computer, because I guess, I mean, what was your intent then in using this as using the Truth and Reconciliation Commission evidence as a backdrop for this? You know, you must have felt like you had something to say about it, even if not as a bleeding heart.
No, not as a bleeding heart, but I think the way I often characterize it is I think apartheid is still really important, even though it was a long time ago, and it crumbled in '94 when Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. I think it's really important today, where we find ourselves as a world, as a society, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was a terrible thing. It was institutionalized hatred, institutionalized racism. And the other reason it's important is because we beat it. And we beat it without going and dropping a whole load of bombs on South Africa. That never happened. There wasn't a foreign power that dropped bombs and so on. But it was a combination of individuals acting inside the country, many whites. You know, and you read about that a little bit in the book. There's that almost internal resistance movement that did exist, that I touch on briefly. But there's also the thousands of people and organizations around the world and governments around the world that told South Africa, we don't think this is good enough. You have to change. You have to bring this to an end. And we did. And I think if you look around now, I think we'd both agree, or everyone would agree, there's a lot of problems that still require that deft hand in terms of bringing something like that to a close.
Yeah, that we still need to pay attention to those issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I pondered as a reader was how you get your characters out of dangerous situations. Because it's funny, when bad things happen by chance, we accept them and we find, that's realistic to us. But when good things happen by chance, it requires a little bit more of a leap, I guess, in terms of how could that lucky good thing have just happened to that person that ended up saving their life? When you're writing a thriller, how do you get that balance right?
For me, being a mathematician, being an engineer, I'm a student of numbers, and probability is a big thing. And so actually the improbable happens all the time. We just often don't see it or notice it because it doesn't have consequences. So I don't really have a big problem with either side of that. The most improbable things happen all the time. I think in the news we've just heard, that poor Australian woman who was shot in the US. That's the most improbable set of circumstances that I've heard in a long time. When I heard it on the radio, I just said to my wife, I said, if you wrote that in a novel, no, it would be ridiculous. It would be beyond belief. Your readers wouldn't buy it. It's just crazy, out of nowhere. So I think that the improbable does happen, but there are really coincidences that happen all the time. Just do we notice them or not? To me, there are a couple of times in each book that I purposefully have put an instance of strangers giving succour, giving help out of their goodness of their own hearts, even though they might be putting themselves in danger. And again, that's about the good side of humanity coming out. We see it all the time, except we don't want to be buried in a flurry of negative.
Yeah, it's so true. I think there is only one incident in the book where I thought, gosh, that was lucky, but again, it was because it was a positive thing, whereas I would have accepted it and an equally negative thing without question probably. So yeah, it is an interesting thing to kind of work out what you can throw in there, and also I think that your understanding of the landscape and the place was really important about what was the likelihood of certain things happening in certain places. Yeah.
So in that particular scene, we talked about it before, where they're in Sosovle, so the dunes and the Skeleton Coast in Namibia. I've been there. I've traveled through there pretty extensively. And that particular road where Clay and even meet that vehicle and gets them out of the dunes, it's pretty well traveled. A lot of Namibians have traditionally gone and camped and fished along that coast, and it was the right time of year in the story. So it wasn't a 1 in a million. It wasn't the one vehicle that happens to come across, once in a while. So it may seem like a bit of a coincidence, but in reality, no, it's plausible enough and it works in the story, and that's what you need.
Yeah. I'd like to go back to asking you about writing violence, about writing these violent scenes, because during that time you have a bit of a strategy about slowing down time to really create impact. Tell me a little bit more about that, about what your thought is.
So time is something that I've always been fascinated by, and it's something that I use quite a lot in the Reconciliation from the Dead on different scales. So actually that's part of fractal theory, self-similarity at all scales, the micro to the macro. That's something that I do try to put into my writing. And part of that is time as a dimension. So particularly, for instance, when there's a scene where it's quite violent and confronting, some readers might tend to skim over, get through it.
Yeah.
But in reality, what happens in life when you're an extremist, if you've been in a fight before or anything like that, is that time does actually slow down. And so I try to break down those scenes and actually, in the writing, slow time down for the reader as well, so they're experiencing that. It's part of that immediacy that I go for, is that you can see things starting to happen in slow motion. If you've ever been in a car accident, same sort of thing. You can start to see things very, very slowly. It's your senses. They're awake. And they're noticing, and they're seeing everything that's unfolding, and I find it a really effective way to both make the violence understandable. We break it down into simple movements, not just he punched him in the face, but the body twists, and the shoulders come around, and the extension of the forearm, and then the knuckles hitting the bone, and the bone cracking, and so on and so forth. It's something that I just find for me it works. I don't know about anybody else, but for me it works.
The female characters in the book are they're not. I mean, terrible things happen to them, and yet they're strong, powerful, potent characters in their
Absolutely,
own right.
yeah.
What did you have a sense of what you wanted to say about women in that place at that time?
Not just about in that place at that time, but in all time. I mean, Vivian, as an example, the South African doctor. I mean, I love that character. I was falling in love with her. I had to back away when I was writing sometimes. Yeah, it's her strength, but also her vulnerability. I mean, strength and vulnerability are the yin and the yang that go together, right? Which makes a whole, a real whole, rather than a 2D cardboard cutout of a person or a character. I'm married to an incredibly strong woman who saved my life, not just metaphorically, but actually, physically. And I'm fascinated by strong women, but who haven't lost their femininity, who haven't lost their vulnerability. And it's just such a beguiling combination. Zuleika is another one. I mean, I just love her as well. So, those are important, and I think they're throughout the book. In fact, you don't really meet the main female character in this, what's soon to be a quartet, a trilogy now, Rania. You only meet her in the very beginning, the epilogue and the prologue.
Yes.
In this book. But she's a powerful influence throughout the whole book, and in the fourth one, their destinies will finally somehow merge.
So because you finished the fourth book.
I just finished it 2 days ago. Well, the first draft.
Yeah.
So it's got a lot of work that needs to be done over the next few months.
But it feels finished for now.
But I got to the end, put it that way. Now I need to go back, and I needed some advice from some very good editors, and my wife in particular, who always reads my first drafts and is strong enough to go, oh, that's terrible, that's bad, you can't do this, change that. She's very uncompromising. So that's my first point of reference.
Yeah.
Always makes things better.
Because I guess knowing that this book is a prequel and a sequel would suggest that you were reading the third of a trilogy. But so it's interesting that you've gone back for a fourth, and having read the book, I now understand that it's absolutely open to that. But do you feel now that, I mean, you're essentially on the verge, potentially, of putting the character of Claymore Straker to bed.
Yeah.
What does that feel like?
It's the last one. I don't want to do more. My publisher wants me to do more, or at least to say that I will keep it in mind that I'll do some in the future, because I think they've done pretty well, and he's a pretty interesting character. But so is Rania. So at the launch here in Perth a few weeks ago, somebody asked me, well, could some of your other characters have their own series like Rania? She's pretty cool. She's a journalist with a very interesting past and a really interesting heritage. She's Pied Noir, which is French for Algerian, half French. So French father, Algerian mother. So a really interesting mix there, and that brings the whole Islam question into play and so on. But look, a little bit sad, but also a bit relieved. I've done 4 of those now, and I've got a lot of other things that I want to work on. I'm starting a new job as well, so it's time to stop the Claymore now after the 4th one. That'll be out in April, May, and I think it'll be okay. We'll see. You never know. And then I've got some other projects on the way.
Well, let's say then that you've written the 4. What have you learned over the course of writing these books about the real ingredients of a thriller?
I think there's 6 really key things that a thriller needs to do, in my view, but not just a thriller. So a good book, literature. I like to think that I'm writing what I call literary fiction, or literary thrillers, maybe. But the first is immediacy. So as I said before, I want to put the reader right there, feel everything. And through that, the second is challenge the reader. So if you're there and you are feeling it and you're really getting into the action, what would you do in that situation? How would you react? And what are the forces that would be pulling you in different directions? Would you take the easy road? Would you take the hard road? Because the hard road are often hard, and that's partly what those books try to reflect. The third one really is that it's got to be realistic. So for the first two to work, immediacy and challenge, it's got to be realistic. You can't be going, oh, that's fake, that would never happen. I think a couple of other things that I really like to see in a book, I think it needs to be intelligent. I mean, I like to learn something as I go along. I like to be exposed to a new culture or a place that I've never been, perhaps. And I try to set my books in fairly exotic locations that some people have been to, but not everybody. I think intensity is really important. I'm an intense person. I like energy. I think that it's particularly a thriller. I think that you want to get to the end of the book and feel like you went 10 rounds with a UFC fighter. You're exhausted, you're battered, you're bruised, but you're exhilarated because you got through it. You're still alive, you're still standing. I think that's really important for that, particularly for that kind of genre. Like, wow, sort of thing. And then, I think finally, for me, a powerful moral theme to underpin it, to make it whole, to bind all the pieces together, and to keep me thinking afterwards. Yeah. So there's a bit of an echo there.
I'm interested, actually, that for your WA book recommendation, you've chosen a thriller, essentially, David Wish-Wilson's Old Scores. Why have you chosen that?
A lot of reasons. I know David. I've met him through writing WA, actually, and he interviewed me for both the launch for my first book, Abrupt Physics of Dying, and also just recently for the launch here in Perth of Reconciliation from the Dead. And we struck up a bit of a friendship because we have a similar outlook on life. We're both pretty blokey, I guess. We got together and have a few beers. And the thing is, I love his writing. I think I really love his sparse prose style. I think it works really well for the thriller. And I like his lead character, Frank Swan. And we actually joked at the Perth Writers Festival. We were on a panel together. We joked that Clay Straker and Frank Swan should go and have a beer sometime. We did the next best thing. The two authors got together and had a beer, and it was fun. It was good.
Yeah, well, he was a guest on Cover to Cover for Old Scores last year. So, yeah, it is. And also, I guess, for you, getting the background of things that have gone on in Perth.
Yeah, for me, being I'm Canadian originally, you can tell by my accent. We've been here 11 years and we're now proud citizens of Australia, but learning about Perth through his writing, he really goes into the recent past and the deep underbelly. I mean, Old Scores, it's a great title. And fascinating to learn more. And he's also written that book, Perth, which is a nonfiction, which is fascinating as well.
Fantastic.
It's really good, isn't it? Yeah. So I think Dave's great.
Yeah. Well, Paul, Reconciliation for the Dead was an eye-opener for me, not only as a reader in terms of the type of book that I was reading, but even as a citizen of the world as well. So congratulations on the work and good luck for the future. And thank you so much for being with me on Cover to Cover.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Reconciliation for the Dead and all the books we've featured on Cover to Cover are highly recommended for book clubs. You can even download free book club notes from the For Readers section of Writing WA's website. If you aren't able to buy the books we feature locally, then call Crow Books in Perth. Mention that you saw the book on Cover to Cover when you place your order and you'll get the postage free. Next month, Shukufe Azar will join me to talk about her novel The Enlightenment of the Green Gage Tree. The story is set in Iran and centres on a family caught in the maelstrom of chaos and brutality immediately after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. This powerful work of literary fiction uses the lyrical magic realism style of classical Persian storytelling. We love receiving your feedback about Cover to Cover. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please use the email address shown on the screen. Thanks for joining me again this month, and thanks again to my guest Paul Hardisty.
Thanks, Mary.
Enjoy reading local and see you next month on Cover to Cover.